Well, I think I'm gonna go ahead and kick it off. People are still rolling in, but I'll do the introduction. And Susan, you should be a co-host now, so you can share your screen whenever is best. But welcome everyone to the Fungus Speaker Series and webinar. Today our speaker, Susan Cook-Patton, will present for about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll take questions both from the chat as well as from folks who want to raise their hand and ask questions live. So before we introduce Susan, I want to very briefly introduce Funga. So Funga is a startup. We restore fungal biodiversity to forests, which in turn accelerates forest regeneration and carbon drawdown. We're focused on enhancing the carbon sequestration of existing forests on the landscape in a way that also supports biodiversity and the communities that rely on those forests. So we're a science-focused organization, and we host these webinars in an effort to both stay connected to the primary science community and also amplify the voice of scientists we think are doing really interesting and important work. And so today, it's our privilege to host Dr. Susan Cook-Patton. She is the lead reforestation scientist at the Nature Conservancy's Natural Climate Solutions team. Her work focuses on quantifying the climate mitigation potential of reforestation, agroforestry, and other natural climate solutions, and helping to infuse the best available science into land management decisions. So Susan has published a huge number of very important studies in very high-profile journals on both the potential and the limitations of natural climate solutions. These are papers we talk about a lot at Funga. We talk a lot about with my colleagues at ETH Zurich and in many other circles. It's hard to discuss the global potential of natural climate solutions and not reference Susan's work. So it's an honor to have her here to share her work personally. And with that, Susan, please take us away.
Oh, Colin, thank you. That's a really nice introduction. So yes, happy to be here today. This is a talk I've not given before, but I realize I've been working at this for almost 9 years. And well, I have a bit of a confession to start with, but I wanted to talk about how the science has evolved through time. And just to note, Colin, you did it well. Like I talk about restoring tree cover, so that includes reforestation, that includes agroforestry, basically putting trees back into the landscape as a climate solution. So let's see, how do I advance here? This is the confession, which is that when I was hired at TNC, the Griscom et al. Natural Climate Solutions paper came out and had this bar in their paper with reforestation as the biggest climate solution. And over 9 years of work, we have shrunk the maximum potential from about 10, I'm waving, 10 down to, I don't know how, let me get whatever in my hand. Will it go away? Oh, well, you get to see my hand the whole time. 10 petagrams of mitigation to about 2 petagrams of mitigation. And some might see that and think that's a problem, but I actually think this is great because we can't do reforestation, agroforestry everywhere. We've got limited time, we've got limited money, we've got limited resources. And what it's really about is honing in on the places where we can get the best returns for all of our investments. So I am one of those people who likes to read the end of a book to make sure I want to spend the time reading the whole book before we get there. So I'm going to start with the main take home, and you can tune out if you want to. But the message I want to leave you with is that restoring tree cover remains a promising climate solution because it offers large, even with the reductions, cost-effective climate mitigation. It's backed by millions of years of research and development, right? Like trees have evolved for a very long time to have figured out how to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere using sunlight, which is amazing, and locking it into long-lived carbon stores. Scalable, we can do it now. I have trees growing in my backyard that the squirrels have planted, right? Like we know how to do this. And it comes with a whole host of additional benefits like habitat for biodiversity. And for my own work, our science can help us identify the places, the actions, and the times where we can get those greatest carbon returns per hectare of investment. And we need to act now because we don't have a lot of time because climate change is here and now. So I often start my talks with an example of how climate change is already impacting our world. I used to have to dig around a little bit to find a good example, and now it's sort of like, pick your example. Which one do you want? The one I'm showing here is not the biggest or most traumatic one, but it was one that just happened in my community a couple of weeks ago, so it's top of mind, where we had a flash flood that resulted from 4 inches of rain coming down within an hour. This is a location that has never had a flash flood warning before. And as you can see, cars got stuck. That's a fire truck in the back of the corner. So it's here now. We need to deploy every conceivable solution that we have. And in my mind, it's not about like, will we hit 1.5? Will we hit 2? Every fraction of a degree matters, and we need to fight for each of those. We've already reached some success, right? We're not going to get 8-degree warming because of the actions we've already taken. And so it's a question of like, how much can we keep towards that 1.5 safe zone? Um, and I'm sure most of you don't need to hear this message, but I just think we can't say it enough. Because when you're working in the space of natural climate solutions, you often get this message where people say, okay, we'll plant a bunch of trees instead of reducing fossil fuel emissions. Like it is not an either or. And I feel like much of the debate centers on that idea. Like we need to do both. I like the bathtub analogy, which our chief scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, uses a lot, where if the amount of the bathtub's rapidly filling with water, the amount of space left before it overflows, is our remaining carbon budget before we hit, major climate issues. What is the first thing that a sensible person would do? It is to turn off the water. It is to reduce emissions into the atmosphere, right? So reducing fossil fuel emissions first. That said, you still also need to pull the plug to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's where something like reforestation and other natural climate solutions are important for removing that carbon. And people often think about technological solutions are going to save us. They will play an important part, but right now they're just a really expensive drop in the bucket of the climate mitigation that we need. So what are natural climate solutions? It's all those actions to reduce emissions and or increase carbon capture through the improved management, protection, and restoration of forest, agricultural lands, wetlands, and grasslands. We had a paper that we wrote last year, that sort of defined what made up a natural climate solution, just so we could sort of lay it to rest of like, what is it? What isn't it? How is it different from nature-based solutions? So I just flagged that there. I'm happy to talk more about it later. But in addition to providing like real, quantifiable, additional climate mitigation, natural climate solutions also come with a host of additional benefits like clean jobs, clean water, habitat for biodiversity, improve the land on which many of us rely for our livelihoods. So many reasons that we want to try to scale them up. As I mentioned, the 2017 paper led by Bronson Griscom came out right when I joined the Nature Conservancy. I was not on this paper, but it was the first attempt to quantify all the different ways we could work with nature to help tackle climate change, and found that nature could provide about a third of the mitigation that we needed to stay below 2 degrees of warming. It was great as sort of like an agenda setting paper to get nature sort of up in people's minds as a climate solution, but it was sort of a first global analysis. And to make it actionable, we realized we need to get it increasingly sort of specific. So the first effort was one for the US and one for Canada. And since then, there have been ones for individual states. We have this top left is California and Oregon. There's one for Indonesia. Others have done ones for the UK and for China, which have been really helpful to show like what are the types of actions that are going to be most impactful in these specific geographies. But what we found is that these studies take a long time. Like our own study, like the NCS Canada and the US one and the global one, took like 3 years and quite a bit of money to pull off. And if we're in a climate emergency, we don't have 3 years to go sort of country by country by country doing these studies. And so for the last 3 years, we've primarily been working on building this tool called NatureBase, naturebase.org, if you want to look at it. And the goal was to provide high resolution, it's 1 kilometer resolution data across the globe of different natural climate solutions so that you could look at it, compare different parts of the world to see where are the places where there's greater opportunity. You can look at the bar chart and figure out what are the types of actions that have the greatest potential. You can pick sort of subsets, like here I'm showing you just the forest pathways. You can go to individual countries and get the opportunity by country. And you can even in this platform get down to sort of county level, though, as I mentioned, the underlying data is all publicly available and at 1 kilometer resolution. And our attempt is to try to pull together one already what was the best available data, as well as create a lot of new novel data sets where there were data needs to fill in the gaps and put it all together in this platform. So I've been responsible for the reforestation and agroforestry portions of NatureBase. And that really stems from this first Griscom et al. Study, which found that restoring tree cover, they called it reforestation here, is often the largest NCS. But if you look closely, there's a little star next to the error bar. And that's because the uncertainty bars were so large, they like literally fell off the figure. They just flagged that it was longer. Um, and I often like to say that I got my job because of these error bars, where the estimate was about 10 petagrams of opportunity, but the uncertainty was 15 petagrams. So the confidence range was 50% larger than the estimate itself. And so the last almost 9 years, I've been trying to shrink these uncertainty bars and improve our understanding of how much climate mitigation can you get and how does that differ depending on where you are in the world and what sort of action are you doing. And when I started at the Nature Conservancy, I used to get emails like this that was I would like instantly freak out when they would arrive because they would just say like, Susan, like, I'm writing some sort of proposal or something like, can you tell me how much climate mitigation I can get if I do something, some sort of restoring tree cover activity in this location? And then it would always be like qualified with like ballpark number, something scientifically reasonable is fine, but end of the day would be great. And I would always freak out because I'm a scientist, right? And I want to get people good numbers. And like the mitigation is going to depend on where you are. Like, are you in a dry forest? Are you in a moist forest? Like, that's really going to influence how much carbon you're going to get. It's going to depend on your approach. Are you letting the forest naturally regrow? Are you setting up an agroforestry system? Are you setting up a plantation? It's also going to depend on time frame, right? Like, if you're looking just in the short, early part of the stand development, it may be that that short rotation, fast growing timber species suggests it has a lot more carbon compared to natural regrowth, which has a slower build. But then if you look at time, like the time averaged mitigation stocks, you can see that the natural regrowth is higher potentially than the short rotation one. The good news is that there's a lot of information out there. It's just too highly distributed to be useful, right? Like it's in thousands of scientific publications. People are trying to make decisions now. They don't have time to go through all those papers to try to come up with like the good number by the end of the day for the proposal. And so what we've done is basically scrape together a lot of the information that's out there and try to put it into useful forms so that people can get the information they need when they need it. And the mitigation potential really boils down to two axes. It's sort of like how much carbon can you get and where the heck are you going to put the trees? And so our work really focuses on those two main axes. So for the first one, how much carbon and how quickly can the carbon be removed? A lot of this work was just a large literature search where we were originally going to tackle all of the different approaches to restoring tree cover. And then we realized how long these things take. So we started with natural regrowth. And then Jacob Bukowski took over the plantations, but the best growth curves are actually in a new paper that Jonah Bush led. And right now we're spending a lot of time working on agroforestry. So just for that first one for natural regrowth, this was our first paper that came out where we took all field-derived, empirically measured estimates of carbon from the literature as well as inventory data that we could get and combined it with 60 different environmental covariates to predict how much carbon you could get from letting forest regrow across the globe. And what we found is at a macro level, patterns you would expect, right? Like faster growth in the tropics, slower growth as you go towards the poles. But when you actually zoom in, you get over 100-fold variation across the globe and how much carbon you can get. And you can get that variation at fairly fine scales. So the utility of this work, I think, is trying to, again, find those places where you can get the greatest returns per hectare of investment. We have recently redone our natural regrowth. This was work led by Nathaniel Robinson, um, where before we just sort of gave like an average rate over the first 30 years. But then we realized, there's older forests too, and trees don't grow in straight lines, right? Like they start out slow and then they get faster and then they slow down again. And so with this work, we got substantially more inventory data. It was still all field-derived data. Same stack of environmental covariates to model biomass at different ages. And then we use that to fit a curve through every pixel. So now for every square kilometer on Earth where forests might conceivably grow, we can tell you how quickly that carbon accumulates, which can tell you, one, what's your maximum rate that you can expect, and when that maximum rate is going to occur. And the take home, which is not a surprise for anyone who understands forest growth curves, is that these sort of mid-age forests, like 20 to 40 years forests that actually have the most rapid carbon removal. But I do think that's a really important message still, because everyone thinks about protecting like the old, mature, iconic forests. And of course, we do want to protect those. And then everyone's like, oh, I'm going to start a brand new forest, right? Like, yay, this is great. But then there's these young secondary forests that are cleared often because they're just sort of viewed as like lower quality. Um, and some of the secondary forests in the tropics have like an 8-year sort of cycle, right? Where they regrow and they're cut down and they regrow and they're cut down. And if we really want to think about how can we get the most carbon removal during the climate critical windows that we have now, protecting these young secondary forests from getting cut down can provide some of the most sort of rapid and largest mitigation. And then for agroforestry that we're working on now, the carbon numbers for agroforestry are complex because agroforestry is complex, right? Like agroforestry has been around for millennia. It's everything from like long-standing indigenous practices to practices adopted to being able to like drive your combine, through the wheat field, but you've got trees on either side. Um, Practiced all over the world. And what people have been given is like default values from the IPCC just don't capture the variation that's out there. So this graph here is showing you the data that underlies the IPCC defaults, but you can see if you're comparing different practices, like the distribution of the data are basically overlapping, right? There's a small trend as you go from intercropping to multistrata. You get something like civil pasture where you actually get 100-fold variation, which makes sense because you could have like one tree in a field, or you could have a full forest canopy with livestock underneath it. And both of those are civil pasture, but very different carbon. So we've been doing what we do, which is scraping together all the data that's out there. And we've pulled together data for more than 1,000 papers, have 25,000 field-derived estimates that span 83 countries. Most excitingly, over 1,000 different species, which is super cool. And they're associated with like 379 different crops. So just a super fun, super complex system. And we're working to try to better characterize the carbon numbers right now. So that was the sort of how much carbon climate mitigation can you get. We've also worked on sort of improved mapping. First, where forests will have net positive climate benefits after accounting for albedo, where you will avoid negative impacts to biodiversity and people, and the places that are most likely to be cost effective. If you're not familiar with the idea of albedo, it's best understood by thinking about wearing a black shirt on a hot day, right? When you're wearing a black shirt, a lot of the sunlight, the heat is retained sort of within you rather than reflected back into space, true of the Earth system. So when you've got lighter land covers like grasslands, more sun is reflected back out into space, whereas trees tend to be darker than the land covers that they replace. And so more of the heat from the sun is retained within the Earth system. The example I'm showing here shows a partial albedo offset, where albedo is only sort of slightly offset the cooling benefit that you get from carbon removal. But there are places in the world where the albedo benefit or albedo offset is large and can entirely negate any of the cooling that would come from the carbon storage at the site. And before, so in that first like error bar I showed you, when they mapped reforestation, in that one, they had, for example, just drawn a line at the boreal and said no reforestation in the boreal because we expect albedo consequences to be high. Um, but we know it's much more complicated than that. And indeed, that's what we found, that it's not just a line at the boreal. Yes, you do get more albedo offsets, which are shown in the red and orange in the boreal, but you also get it quite strongly in drylands as well. And so this work, which was led by Natalia Hasler, um, mapped the expected albedo offset in the places that are likely to be climate positive, blue, versus climate negative, red, across the globe. And what we found, actually using the Restore data as well as grain for green data and other uh, locations of specific restoration projects, though Restore was by far the most extensive, that either by luck or good planning, more than 80% of the projects are already occurring in places that are climate positive, which was really encouraging because nobody had the tools to actually look at their albedo consequences before. And when it was available, we were like, okay, phew, I was a little worried to see what we would find. But in fact, the restoration community is already doing a good job on this front. As far as mapping places that are most likely to have positive outcomes for biodiversity and people, we recently redid the global opportunity map for reforestation. And we did it because there were quite a few past efforts, and those past efforts have been heavily critiqued for several reasons. One was that they suggested putting trees in native grasslands or places that are naturally low tree cover, which is bad for biodiversity. Trees probably won't survive. Also, more likely to have an albedo offset. Or the fact that they're suggesting we put trees in places that already have sufficient trees. It's just that the data couldn't pick up the trees that were already there. Or that they ignored the fact that those lands are already occupied by people and they're using them for their own purposes. And so we don't want to say this is a priority location without consulting the local communities who really should be the deciders in those situations. And so we addressed a lot of the critiques and we came up with a smaller area of about 195 million hectares, which is that first bar that you see there. But then we went farther and broke it down into a menu of options because the idea in my head is like, who am I sort of sitting in Washington, D.C. to be telling people like, these are the reforestation opportunities. What I want to present is instead a menu of options to allow people to pick amongst. And so we looked at things like places where you can improve water quality, places that are adjacent to a forest, so you can get the biodiversity benefit of buffering the forest, as well as potentially improve your ability to use natural regrowth. Places where the local communities have more control, right? High individual rights, secure land tenure, low rural livelihood conflict. And then places that might be a little easier, like protected areas or national restoration goals, where they sort of intend to do reforestation or protect those lands. And what we found is when you start sort of layering on these different features that you might want from the landscape, it's possible to have win-wins, but it's quite hard to get sort of win-win-wins where you're like checking lots of boxes all in one spot. About 80% of the overall opportunity is in places adjacent to a forest, so that's good for biodiversity and good for natural regrowth, as well as places that have low rural and livelihood conflicts. So those were good. But if you're trying to find a protected area that's also good for water, the opportunities get small. So you really have to think like, what is it that we want from the landscape? All right. And then this was our work to map costs. So reforestation is often presented as one of the more expensive natural climate solutions compared to like avoided deforestation, which our own work has shown could be about 7 times more cost effective. It's easier to keep the carbon in the landscape than it is to try to regrow it after the fact. And something like improved forest management, where you're not trying to change the land use, you're just trying to improve how that land is managed. But we didn't have very good sort of spatially explicit understanding of how regrowth and plantations vary across the landscape. So this was work led by Jonah Bush, where we developed new regrowth curves, though the Robinson ones I think are the best available right now, and new plantation curves, as well as spatially explicit maps of opportunity cost, um, based on a lot of household survey data, and implementation cost, based on a bunch of World Bank data that Jeff Vincent and his team had compiled. And we were able to sort of smush all that data together and get spatially explicit marginal abatement cost curves. And what we find is that there's actually more than double the cost effective, if you're counting $50 per ton of CO2 as cost effective mitigation than previously reported. And about half the time, natural regrowth is more cost effective, and about half the time, plantations are. And I think that natural regrowth is particularly striking because we don't account for, or we do account for timber revenue in the plantation. So you would think that would make it more cost effective. But natural regrowth, even without downstream revenue, is still a great option for restoring tree cover to the landscape. So for all of our work, we put as much as we can into nature-based now, to have that comprehensive spot where the best available data can be found. But throughout, our goals are to, one, make tools that are publicly available, so anybody can use them, peer-reviewed so that it has sort of that stamp of rigor, and it's just fully transparent methods so that we can help advance the movement overall. And then we like to put them into tools like nature-based to make it easy for people to explore the data, because I'm assuming not many people, perhaps your crew, will read all the science papers, but many people don't have the time. And it can be helpful to be able to explore sort of different options. So this is another tool we have specifically for the US, which maps reforestation opportunity, again, at sort of the county level, and allows you to click on and off different menu options. And then we have a reforestation hub for the globe, which brings in the more recent data from Kurt Fessenmeyer's work, that again lets you sort of turn on and off those different scenarios and explore sort of the menu of options as well. So back to where I think I've done okay on time. The ending slide again, just to repeat it all, which is that yes, we have gone from about 10 petagrams to 2 petagrams, but reforestation, agroforestry still represent very cost-effective options for removing carbon. We've got it's ready to go, millions of years of R&D and all of those additional benefits. And we and others have done a lot of the science to really help hone in on the places where we can get the best returns. So where does that leave us now? It really is, I think, time, well past time even, to move from ambition to action. There's a lot of reforestation goals, which is great. Everyone likes to put trees back, myself included. But now is the time to get moving. I think the science is not really the limiting factor anymore. And so what have I learned over the 9 years? First, leverage natural regrowth as much as possible. I think everybody likes to plant trees, but we don't have enough seeds or time or nursery capacity or people to plant the trees at the scale that we need. And the forest can grow quite fine when the conditions are right, when the seed dispersers are present and the site is not too trashed. I'm sure Funga also works on trying to improve the conditions for forest recovery too. We should protect those sort of young secondary forests alongside mature forest. They are being cut down frequently, and we can get really rapid and timely carbon removal from protecting them. A lot of our work is about driving resources towards the places with the greatest density of opportunity. We can't do everything everywhere, so we're trying to shine a light on the map towards the places where there's lots of opportunity. But of course, global maps only get you so far, and it's really about what do the local communities want, and they're the ones that need to be empowered to make the choices. And as part of that, there's sort of no perfect solution, right? Like we're going to do natural regrowth here and agroforestry there. Like there, no, it's about providing a menu of options, and helping people sort through what they think will work best for their specific context. Um, we like to say right tree, right place, right way. So right tree, often a native species, better for biodiversity, will grow well in that habitat. Right place, like put it in a forested ecosystem rather than a grassland. And right way is about working with the local communities to make sure they're fully part of the process and getting a type of system that they want. And then I think this big one is really learning. We've done a lot of work already, but I think those lessons have not sort of been bubbled up and aggregated and shared as much as they could be. And ideally, we want to make sure that future projects stand on the shoulders of all of those that come before. So with that, thank you. There are lots of funders for this work. I did not have time, but I have so many amazing collaborators. And at some point, I'm going to write all their names down on a slide, tiny font. Um, and then you for listening to this presentation. So with that, I think we do have lots of time for questions, which is great.
All right, that was incredible, Susan. Everyone, please smash an emoji in your React bar. It's very important. Um, this was such a wild body of work, and it's just like covering so many deep questions about, in a spatially, globally explicit way. Um, Anyone who has questions, please, please, please pop them in the chat, and then I will review them and call you out maybe and ask you to ask your question to Susan. But I am happy to kick us off. A million questions, but I think the first one is just given that you've drilled into so many of the big questions of, where do we do reforestation or other natural climate interventions? Like how fast do those accrue carbon? How are they interacting with albedo and other, ecosystem level feedbacks? What do you still want to know? Like, what's the next big question on your mind that you'd love to get at in sort of this framework?
So the other thing, one, agroforestry. I'm really excited about agroforestry because I think one of the limitations is that we can only put sort of full forest back in, a fairly limited set of places, right? Like we really have to figure out how to integrate trees in human landscapes. And agroforestry, I think, can be sort of the win-win-win where you can get increased climate mitigation and improve livelihoods and habitat for biodiversity. And the carbon numbers are just so sort of Wild West. So getting an increased understanding is what I'm excited about what we're working on. The other thing that we're working on too is addressing durability issues around forest-based natural climate solutions, because that comes up all the time, right? And I think it is constraining investments in forests because people are concerned that they're all going to burn up. Um, but one, they're not all going to burn up, right? Like risks vary across the landscape, and we can use science to show the places that are high risk and let's not prioritize projects there, and places that are low risk where we could prioritize projects. And then, places with intermediate risk, we can figure out how risky it's going to be and use that to inform mechanisms for compensation, like buffer pool size. So we're working on that to map the likelihood of risk as well as the severity of risk too, because it's not like the whole forest will burn down, right? Like you lose some of the carbon, but not all. And then trying to think about how it'll recover after disturbance, because I think that third element is also lost, right? Like it just all goes poof into the atmosphere and it never comes back. Like no, the forests actually do regrow. Um, and yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of other questions that we need to answer, but those are our two that we're working on at the moment.
No, that permanence or durability one is so big. I mean, it's such a big conversation on the market side of climate solutions. And, I think the biggest thing is like, how do we express it, right? Like people would love it to be a binary, where it's permanent or it's not. But should we be talking about ton years? Should we be talking about some sort of, yeah, it's a big question. And the more
Yeah.
we can put science to bear on that.
And that's why we do prefer durability over permanence, because permanence is like a binary, like it's forever, it's not. And like that's actually not what happens. There's a spectrum of persistence. And so durability, I think, is a better term for capturing that.
Awesome. All right, we're going to go to Josh Parrish on the Funga team, who has a question about likelihood of success, restoration success, given invasive species and everything else. But Josh, do you want to come off mute?
Sure. Yeah, Susan, just curious about, and maybe, if you've got some examples to share or like, this area looks like a sweet spot, but I'm just curious because not all places are equal as I think about, our friends that are working in the tropics and leafcutter ants and all kinds of, I mean, it's like nature wants to grow everywhere, but what's going to grow there, right? And if we're trying to grow a forest, or restore a forest, it's just, yeah, just curious like that side of it. And as after I asked my questions, I think you're already kind of hitting on that, like looking at the risk side of it, but also then the flip side would be like, well, the likelihood of success per, per hectare.
So you do touch on where I think our science is not super strong, which is sort of at the project level, right? Like we're doing 1 kilometer global maps, which are good at suggesting potential, but then there's a lot of site level variables that are going to influence the level of success that you can expect. We did just have a paper that came out in PNAS that Evan Fricke led, where he looked at seed dispersal disruption. And it, took our map of natural regrowth where we're like, this is how much carbon you could get if the forest regrows. And he was like, okay, where do we actually expect it to regrow? And was able to see sort of across substantial inventory data sets that you can actually see that signal of whether or not your seed dispersers are present. Because in the tropics, like 80% of the trees need animals for dispersal. Um, and so, that does suggest like adjacent to existing forest, you're going to have greater success. You do have to think about, is it chock full of invasive grasses that are going to limit potential. And you can see that variation at very fine scales, right? Like you look left and the forest is coming back great, and you look right and it's not. And it's due to soil conditions or is due to the invasive species that are there. And that's where I think that last, like, we need to learn from
Mhm.
existing projects, like where did it work? Why? Where didn't it work? Why? How can we leverage that information to do a better job with future projects?
Super helpful. It hit my mind because I was driving up from you from I-95 yesterday, and trees should be growing along I-95, but there's lots of vines
Those
anyways.
vines, I know. Yeah. That's another, I think, really promising natural climate solution is just liana control, especially in the US where they're all like invasive vines. In the tropics, you've got to think about biodiversity concerns from massive liana control. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think we have a really good question here from David Holdridge asking about the trade-off between protecting these secondary forests, which you call out as, rapid carbon accumulators, and a lot of them are also the producers of commodities, timber commodities that a lot of people are relying on as also playing an important role in mitigating emissions from the built environment. David, do you want to come off mute and ask this more explicitly, or I'm happy to.
Uh, sure. Thank you, Colin. I think you pretty much covered it. Yeah, the question that I wrote in the chat was just verbatim. If the secondary intermediate forests that you call for the heightened protection of are also like happen to be the most ample supply for increasing industries such as the mass timber industry, which are attempting to like subvert carbon heavy concrete and steel construction, like what's the happy medium intersection point for protecting those forests and also potentially increasing the supply of like forest products as sustainable alternatives for more carbon heavy building practices.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the work we've done have been primarily with secondary regrowth natural forest, where you're actually probably not going to get a ton of sort of timber extraction from those systems compared to like a plantation system. And this does go back to a point I think I made about there not being a perfect solution. Like sometimes natural regrowth is going to be the right solution, but if it's a system where wood production is paramount, like then a plantation is going to make more sense. We are doing some work right now to look at mixed species plantations to see if you can leverage all the ecology around how diversification leads to greater production and resilience. as potentially an alternative to monoculture plantations, but even monoculture plantations can help, buffer native forest and reduce pressures on native forest for timber extraction. And to the point that you made, wood storage is another carbon store. The accounting on that gets complicated because it depends on, how much gets left in the forest, how much is left on the mill floor, how far is the wood transferred. But I haven't done any of the work, but there is plenty of work suggesting that it's much less carbon intensive than steel and concrete, and they just make really beautiful buildings. So that's another exciting avenue, but not one I've worked on. We only work on the supply side accounting and haven't tried to get into the demand side accounting.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your answer.
All right, we have a question from Aaron Wilson. Aaron, do you want to come off mute and ask this one?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. I was just thinking about the kind of like various types of data that you use here in your analyses, and was wondering, is there a certain type that's like especially hard to collect that, like, if it were so much easier, would that like have a bigger impact for kind of accelerating your learning cycles and like reducing the uncertainty?
Yes, I love that question. I've got two separate answers. One is cost data. It is so hard to get cost data. I've been looking forever. Like the paper where we looked at cost effectiveness, the reason we had it was because Jeff Vincent and his team like scoured all of the World Bank data. But even that is sort of, only covered lower and middle income countries. And it's so hard to get cost data. And we really need that because that's the big question everyone's trying to answer. The other is that as someone who has been through like thousands of scientific publications now, and we did it mostly manually, we keep trying to figure out, how we can leverage AI to accelerate the process, and it just is not quite there yet. And the issue is because of the way we're writing our science papers. The data are just not presented in sort of a uniform standard way. And so sort of like my magic wand would be that we have a much more consistent way of reporting the data so that it becomes easier to aggregate it. Because our agroforestry, for example, we've been working on it for 3 years. It's going to be an amazing data set, but it's already 3 years out of date. Like we stopped collecting 4 years out of date in 2021 because we're like, okay, no more new data. Like we need to just sort of clean up and analyze the data that we have.
Sure.
And, if you've probably seen lots of figures where it's like the rate of increase in knowledge through time, like it's always exponential, like on a topic. So like there's a lot of papers that have been published in the last few years on agroforestry carbon data that we're not capturing because we just can't keep pace with the production of knowledge when we attempt to aggregate it.
Sure. Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. We have a question from Anne Rejo on our team about species composition. Anne, you want to come off mute and ask this one?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for coming to talk, Susan. This was really good. And it's nice to meet you. I'm just wondering, following kind of everyone's questions about secondary forests, it's like they could be better for carbon sequestration and biodiversity. And so it's kind of feels like protecting sometimes something that like could, yeah, increase carbon sequestration if we added some more species or something. So how did you think about that? I know in cost effectiveness, I guess, comes up.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting in like the carbon market perspective, and Pedro Brancaleon has a really nice paper on this. Like there's not currently a mechanism for rewarding protecting young secondary forest. The avoided deforestation are really about like protecting a mature forest. And for it to be a reforestation project, usually it has to be cleared for 10 years before you can put a project on. And so in places where these forests are just like rapidly shifting, having new dynamic baseline approaches, I think, are helpful because you can say like, I protected this spot and look, it's doing better than sort of my neighbors. Like, therefore I have earned carbon credits. To like say, okay, well, now it's going to be clear, it's cleared, and now I have to wait 10 years before we can do anything, right? Like we're trying to solve a climate crisis now. So I do think there need to be more mechanisms for actually valuing those secondary forest. But yes, if we're really interested in like how much carbon removal can we get during this like climate critical window, there's a really large untapped opportunity there.
All right, and we have a question from Shannon Lee, who's asking a particular question about the Pacific Northwest. Shannon, do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, I'd love to. And thanks so much, Susan, for sharing all of your wonderful visualizations. In one of those, I noticed that there was a dense blue spot in the Pacific Northwest, which is where I'm located. And so, of course, I got excited. But I know that in our area, a lot of forest management challenges have come up around disease. And in those secondary young forests that you've been talking about, it's been a particular issue. And so I'm excited to see that those are, there's a lot of potential in our area. But I was wondering if you had any information about restorative forestry interventions that have excited you, particularly around the lens of disease. And I love that you also touched a little bit on wildfire science, because that's another thing I'm passionate about. And so wildfire playing a role in disease mitigation has been contentious because we've had huge wildfires in the Pacific Northwest as well. So interested to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much.
Yes, well, so the Pacific Northwest has really great carbon accumulation rates. So we've got lots of timber industry there for a reason. And that's, I think, so the albedo map combines both the carbon, like the potential carbon storage, as well as the albedo offset. And so in that location, it's really the carbon that's making it bright blue. I mean, those are not naturally that diverse forest, right? Like, but I am, I've my PhD research was about biodiversity and ecosystem functioning research. So the idea of system diversification has always held sort of a special place in my heart. And we know from like decades of research that diverse systems have more disease resistance, as well as are more stable to environmental sort of shocks like drought, and they're more productive because they're not competing with each other as much. And so I do think diversification of plantations is potentially an option for dealing with disease. But it is interesting when you look through all the literature, the research, biodiversity and ecosystem functioning research is in like experimentally tractable systems that PhDs can do, right? Like grasslands, seagrass beds, little ecosystem microcosms. And then there has been more research in forests, like there's the tree div net network, where these are sort of tree size diversity manipulations. And there's a lot of great research coming out of those. But those are often set up to test ecological principles about things like, disease spread or how do mycorrhizal affiliations impact performance of the systems, but they're not usually at like operational plantation scale. So there's only a few systems where they have done like the research to figure out like what density, which species, like when do you thin this one versus that one? Like there's still quite a bit of research to go, I think, before it's operationalizable at a large scale. Where people have done the work, it's in these more naturally low diversity systems where it'll be like a conifer and aspen sort of naturally occur, and people have figured out how to make those types of systems work. But yeah, I'm not a disease expert, so I suspect you have more insights than me on this area, but those are my thoughts.
All right. Well, Susan, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to share with us and all the people who've joined the webinar. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This was awesome. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. It's great to talk with you all today. And I will put my email address in the chat if anyone has follow-up questions or would love to tell me about whatever you're working on.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. We do these, we try and do these once a quarter. So watch LinkedIn. We'll be bringing more amazing people like Susan to talk to you about natural climate solutions or ecology or all of the above.